Welcome, everybody. This is Priyanka Jain from ARING, and you're listening to the Analytics Cafe podcast, the show that sheds light on practical analytics and data science topics for people in business who love to put data to work.
Today, I'm talking with Gary Cokins on how to get executive buy-in. Thank you so much for joining me here, Gary. Let's start with your introduction first.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. A little bit about myself. My undergraduate was Cornell University, Industrial Engineering. I did my MBA at Northwestern University's Kellogg. I'm almost 70 years old, so when I look back on my career, it was really in three-thirds. First decade was in industry. I was with FMC Link Belt in a division controller role. In the middle was with a consultant with Deloitte and KPMG, and then Electronic Data Systems, which is now part of HP. And up to 5 years ago, when I retired, I'm partly retired, I was with SAS, the large analytics software vendor.
And so you would know a lot about executive buy-in because you were dealing with executives all the time. So why is executive buy-in important?
Well, I think executives need to always exhibit vision and inspiration and defining the mission where the organization wants to go. I think part of the problem, and I reflect on John Kotter, a famous Harvard Business School professor's books and articles on leading change, and he distinguishes the difference between managers and leaders. Mm-hmm. He said, managers, they cope with complexity. That's why they have spreadsheets and budgets and so forth, but what leaders cope with is really change, so that's why they really need to really create that vision, that setting that direction. Unfortunately, a lot of managers get promoted to leaders and they just start managing more intensively, more spreadsheets, and, they've got to basically be inspiring.
So the difference between a leader and a manager is one, the executive or the leader has to have a vision, and they drive more by vision instead of by tactic.
Yeah, but also inspiration. I mean, people have to follow leaders.
Yeah, that's great. So from the other side, as you are trying to work with an executive, how do you get executive buy-in? What are the tips?
I've always followed a formula I learned decades ago, which is D times V times F is greater than R. And so I'll get to what they stand for, but since it's a multiplicative formula, if D, V, or F are zero or very small, the left side of the equation is not going to overcome the right side, and the R stands for resistance to change. And I think people underestimate how much there is resistance to change. And it's human nature. People love the status quo. Only babies like change. So you're asking, what does D, V, and F stand for? Well, D stands for dissatisfaction with the current state. Unless people are unhappy, they're not going to be motivated to move. V stands for vision of what better looks like. So, if they've got significant pain or discomfort or dissatisfaction, they're looking for that lifeline, that sort of like lifeboat. That's the V. F is sort of the sleeper. F stands for first practical steps, because if they think that vision, that V is overly theoretical, unaffordable, too complicated, they're not going to basically, move. What I've learned in my career is spend the time on the D. You've got to create that discomfort. And a good way to do it is through the Socratic method, just how Socrates, the Greek philosopher, taught, his others. You ask questions that create sort of that discomfort. Things like, if it's strategy, does every employee know and understand the executive team's strategy? Do we know where we make or lose money truly with good profit information? Is our budgeting out of date in a couple of months after it's published and we stick with it? Should we move to rolling financial forecast? Those types of questions create that discomfort, and then the executive will say, well, how would I address that? And now you start basically getting the buy-in from them.
That's great. That's great. And aligning them, I think what you're kind of teeing up is also, first make sure that you can create sort of dissatisfaction so they understand, but in the context of what's important to the executive, right?
Correct.
And aligning with the vision of the executive, and once you have roped them in, once they're like, yeah, I am dissatisfied, it's not working very well, it is aligning with the vision I have, then it's like, okay, here are the first practical steps, here's how to get started, here's the next steps. Right?
Aligning is a key word. What I didn't mention in my bio is I've actually authored quite a few books, and it's a long story. It started way back with KPMG. I wrote a book on activity-based costing, and then that broadened out into this area called enterprise or corporate performance management, which is basically a bunch of different methods like strategy execution, profitability reporting, driver-based rolling financial forecast, enterprise risk management, lean management, all these moving parts like gears in a machine. But one of them is that strategy execution, and that's sort of led somewhat by the Kaplan and Norton strategy map and balanced scorecard. And the key is, how do you align the behavior, priorities, actions of employees with the executive team strategy? And that's really done through measures, the so-called key performance indicators, KPIs. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you can't manage it, you can't basically improve it.
Yes, exactly. I completely agree. And I can't tell you how many of this dysfunction I'm seeing where, the D, V, and F is not lining up, and thereby you don't have an executive buy-in. You start rolling with the project, and there you see the failure. So getting to the next question and the last question, where have you seen the biggest failure in as you get an executive buy-in?
It's not one specific favors or example, but something I've just observed over the last few years. I think in the past, the best leaders and executives had the best answers. Today, I don't think that's the case. I think today the best leaders and best executives have the best questions. There is too much volatility. There's too much uncertainty. There's too much complexity for them to rely on their so-called sixth sense or gut feel or intuition or the answers that they made in the past years ago that got them promoted to the top.
Yeah.
They need to create a culture of discovery and investigation and tolerance for making mistakes, as long as we learn from the mistakes. And then clearly, we're into the era of data analytics, big data scientists. They've got to really, this is back to the buy-in, they've got to start advocating analytics as really a source of a competitive advantage.
Right.
Because, the old generic strategies from Michael Porter, Harvard professor, which was sort of like low-cost provider is one, focus on a narrow group of loyal customers, that kind of stuff. Those are all vulnerable.
Yeah.
Basically, competitors can basically repeat complete. So to really create that competitive advantage, since strategy is always going to be changing, they basically have to adopt analytics.
Yeah, learn from the data. And as I always say, data doesn't speak, it responds, and it responds to intelligent questions. And, executives are in a perfect position to hold themselves and others responsible for asking intelligent questions of the data so they can get meaningful information out of the data. And this is all towards, we were talking about executive buy-in, all towards as people are building data literacy for the organization, they need to start with executive buy-in. And the executive buy-in, as you said, the formula is a DVF needs to be greater than R for people to get. So this is perfect way to describe exactly what we do as well with our work in data science with our SWAT team at Airing. And hope people will find it useful. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
It was a pleasure to be with you.